But I'm going to go ahead and record this. And I want to, before we jump into the topic for today, I want to remind you, I don't think it's too soon, that there's a final in this course. And it's a pretty big deal, right? Because the final exam in this course is 30% of your course grade, a big chunk of your single biggest chunk of your course grade. And it's comprehensive, right? And so I've been thinking a lot over the last week about the final exam and really the conclusion of the semester, how to wrap up. And so I called up a copy of the course syllabus here, or the last couple of pages of the course syllabus here, to share a couple of bits of information with you. First of all, notice that the final exam for this course is scheduled for Thursday, May the 13th. From 12:30 to 2:30 p.m. You will come to this classroom at a little bit different time, a little bit later than you're accustomed to, but it's the last possible final exam slot, I think, at any rate. But that's okay. I mean, that gives you lots of good time to prepare for the final exam. I know you're juggling other classes too, but the fact that this one comes pretty late in the game, you may take that as good. But anyway, you'll need to bring with you on that Thursday a Scantron form that has not the kind that we've been using for the quizzes, the kind that has 50 on the front and 50 on the back. It is a 50 multiple choice question final exam. So we'll need the front side of that, but that's the form that you need to get there. It has a number, and I don't remember what it is. I'll try to remember to check that for you. You have it? What's the number of the form?
Oh, I have it too.
It's 882.
882. Yeah, that's what I was remembering. I just didn't want to say that without being sure. Okay, so yeah, you'll need one of those, and you'll need a pencil. We won't do it on the screen like we've been doing the quizzes. I will pass out a test booklet to you, and you have as much of the hour. The department allots an hour for the final exam, so will have as much of that hour as you want to complete the final exam. Having said that, I'll say that historically students, I would say on average take about 20 minutes, but don't make that your primary objective to get in and get out as quickly as possible. I'm always shocked when somebody hands me their Scantron form like 5 minutes after the exam has started. So, how could you possibly even read through those and have a feeling they're just, At any rate, you'll have the full hour if you want it. What else can I say about the final exam itself? I guess that's it, but there are a couple of other things I want to say here.
It's 1 hour or 2 hours?
The department puts an hour limit on it, okay?
Gotcha.
The college has this 2-hour slot that's set aside for classes that meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays at, what time does this class start? 12:15. So that's the information that you're seeing there, but the department places an hour limit on it.
You have 2 hours.
So that means.
Yeah, I know, that's what I'm saying, that the college, when the college, whoever does it for the college, I don't know who does it, but when they put together the final exam schedule, they say, okay, classes that meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 12:15, this time period, have this time slot to administer the final exam. But then the department says, okay, but limit it to an hour, okay? Which, it's plenty of time. It's more than enough time, right, than to complete this final exam. Okay, so a couple of things I wanted to address here, though, with you pertaining to the final exam. So I have the last couple of pages of the syllabus up here, because, I've indicated a topic here for week 15. This week, we're going to be dealing with the topic on state revenues. And of course, we just took the week 14 quiz and lecture quiz, and we'll take the week 14 lecture quiz or reading quiz on Thursday as usual. And then next week, we come in, week 15, we'll take the week 15 lecture quiz on Tuesday as usual. And that will test you over the material that we covered this week in class, okay? And then on a week from Thursday, we'll take the reading quiz for week 15, which of course quizzes you over the reading assignment for week 14, which is chapter 11, right there, okay? notice that I provided a reading assignment here for for week 15, but obviously we're not going to be taking a reading quiz over that. Okay? Right? We're not going to come in on week 16 and take a reading quiz, right? And then the same thing with the lecture quiz, right? So I was reflecting a little bit, thinking, well, maybe let's rethink a little bit how we treat this last week of the semester. And I decided that it might be a good idea, given the weight of the final exam, to suggest to you that we use those last two class meetings, the week 15 class meetings, as final exam review sessions. I've never done that in any class at any time. I've done several things this semester that I've never done before, experimenting some. So that's what I'm going to suggest that we do. Now, it's going to depend on you, right? How useful that is. Because I'm not going to come in and just, if you don't have questions for me, I'm not going to come in and just blab just to fill up time, okay? So you need to come prepared. And so what I recommend that you do is you take this document that's been out here for you from the very beginning of the semester, print it out if you want to, okay? Take it in one hand, take all the notes that you've taken from class sessions in the other hand, your textbook in the other hand, and use this guide to kind of go through the notes that you have and identify questions that you want to ask so that you can come in a week from today and a week from Thursday, and we can make really good use of that time, right? Now, I do have to say that don't give me a question like, hey, can you explain the exclusionary rule, okay? Because, frankly, I've already done that, okay? If you have a specific question about the exclusionary rule, that's a different matter, okay? So I'm not going to re-lecture material that I've already lectured, or I'm not going to just repeat what the authors of the textbook said about something. You're going to have to give me specific questions, and hopefully that guide will help prompt some questions, okay? I think that might be a better use of our time than to try to cover material in class that you're not going to be quizzed over anyway. Okay? How's that? Does that sound all right? All right, so keep that in mind. Don't forget, because really, I'm worried that we don't make the best use of those class meetings next week, and I want them to be valuable. I don't want them to just be kind of a session where we sit here and look at each other, because the college says that's what I have to do if we don't have material to cover. I just have to sit here and look at each other. You understand? Did I do this?
Yes, sir.
I did. Thank you. Thank you very much. But we don't even have anybody here. So anyway. All right. Well,
I watched those YouTube videos.
go look at them later.
Don't worry.
All right. So today, this week, we're talking about revenue policy in Texas, and that means we're going to talk a lot about taxes. I heard somebody in a previous class meeting, maybe at the end of the class meeting last time or something, give some version of this quote from, it's attributed to Benjamin Franklin. In this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. If you ever want to bring a successful end to an argument that you're having with somebody, just quote Benjamin Franklin. That puts an end to like everybody's, Benjamin Franklin. Hey, here's one maybe that you haven't heard though. I don't know if this story is apocryphal or not, but former Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes was once reported in a book by one of his associate Supreme Court Justice, Felix Frankfurter, as a conversation that he was having with the secretary, in which the secretary said, "Don't you hate paying taxes?" And Justice Holmes argued or said in response, "No, young feller, I like to pay taxes with them by civilization." Now, I don't know if that story is apocryphal or if it's an actual story, but Holmes did write in an opinion one time in the United States Supreme Court that taxes are what we pay for civilized society, which is an interesting take, a little bit different than Benjamin Franklin's take, I suppose, But there's some truth to that, right? That, why do we have to pay taxes? Well, because we buy civilization with that. Well, we are going to talk a little bit about taxes and tax policy in Texas over the next couple of class meetings. I want to approach this a little bit differently than the intuition might suggest that we do it. I want to start with a couple of specific questions, and then from that, develop that today and probably into the class meeting on Thursday. And then when we finish that up, we can sort of back up and talk in a more general way about tax policy in Texas. Okay? So initially, I think as a political matter, the whole debate over taxes is really over the question of who pays. Right? You get a lot of debate in American politics. Texas is part of that. Over what kinds of taxes we're going to have. Are we going to have, an income tax? Is it going to be a progressive income tax? Maybe we should have a flat tax. Maybe we should have some sort of proportional tax. Maybe we should have a national income tax, or maybe we should replace state sales taxes with, excise taxes or whatever. The question oftentimes on the surface is about the kind of tax that we're going to implement. But what I'm suggesting to you is that as a political matter, what's really underneath those superficial questions about taxes is the question about who's going to pay them. Okay? Who's going to pay the taxes? Now, if I put the word really in there, like the adverb, and put it in italics to really kind of draw your attention to it, say, who really pays taxes? That kind of changes an indication of what we really might be addressing here. Okay? Who really pays taxes? Right? And that's really one of the questions that I want us to address over the next couple of class meetings. Now, that question, who really pays, there's a couple of subsidiary questions that we have to address to do any sort of objective analysis. Okay? First question is, does it matter who the government imposes the tax on? That's one question that we're about to address. And then the second question is, how is that tax burden distributed? Where we typically like to talk about the distribution of the tax burden in terms of income groups. Right? All right, so let's address the question of who really pays by beginning with a couple of definitions. Okay? We're going to distinguish here between what economists refer to as the statutory incidence of a tax, or sometimes you see the term legal liability. So statutory incidence of the tax on the one hand, and the economic incidence of the tax on the other hand. So statutory incidence or legal liability of a tax falls on the entity that is legally responsible for remitting the tax revenues to the taxing jurisdiction, whether that's the national, state, or local government. If I was to ask you, who pays sales tax? Who pays the sales tax? What would your answer to that be? The customer. Everybody agree with that? Okay. Have any of you ever written a check to the state of Texas for sales tax?
No.
Have any of you ever made a direct electronic payment to the state of Texas for sales tax?
No.
No? So why are you saying that the customer pays it?
The business.
Yeah, the business, the retailer pays the sales tax, right? Now, but if I say, oh, come on, who really pays the sales tax? You see that how the word really just sort of changes that?
Yeah.
Okay? And that's where you say, oh, yeah, well, really, Fagan, come on, really, the consumer pays the sales tax. But what you're talking about there, I'm sorry, Kyle, let me say this real quick. What you're really talking about there is a distinction between the statutory incidence of the tax and the economic incidence of the tax. Go ahead.
So are they allowed to make money off of the consumer from the sales tax? Like, say if they're supposed to pay this certain amount, do they up the sales tax to make a final profit?
No, certainly don't have the authority to do that.
Okay, that's
Okay?
what I was asking.
But it's actually a more nuanced question than even you might think asking the question, which is part of what we need to get into a little bit here. Okay? All right, so we know the statutory incident simply refers to who is legally responsible for turning that tax revenue over to the government. And in the case of the general sales tax in Texas, that's the retailer. Okay? But who really pays the tax? Come on, Fagan, who really pays the sales tax? You believe it's the consumers? Well, maybe, maybe not. We'll see. Okay? But what you're really talking about there is the economic burden of the tax. Who feels the economic pinch of the tax?
We do.
Well, I'm saying that's just initially making the distinction here between the two different concepts, statutory incidents and economic incidents. So statutory incidents refers to the legal liability or the legal responsibility for turning the tax revenue over to government, and the economic incidents or the economic burden of the tax falls on the entity or entities that incurs the economic cost. So if the point's not entirely clear to you yet, let me just try to drive the point home by saying we do not have a situation, for example, in Texas or anywhere else in this country, for that matter, where let's say you go into a retail store and you purchase some item on which the sales tax is imposed. I don't have anything handy, but a sweater, right? You go into a department store, you're doing your shopping, you select the sweater, and you go put it up on the counter. Let's say it's a discount store. The price tag says $20. Can you buy a sweater for $20 anywhere? I don't know. It doesn't matter. $20, right? You pop that down. The the cashier scans it and reads it and says, okay, that's $20, and you pay the cashier $20, and then you go over here, and the tax man pops up from behind the counter and says, wait a minute, there's that little matter of the sales tax, 8 1/4 on 20, whatever that comes out to, $1.60 or something, okay? Right? That's not the way that it works, right? The consumer is not legally responsible for turning that tax revenue over to government. Well, they added on to the purchase price that you, the consumer, turn that money over to the retailer, and then the retailer is responsible for remitting the tax revenue to government. Okay? That's administratively how it works. Okay? So, one of the questions, when you all tell me, oh, Fagan, who really pays the sales tax? I'll tell you who really pays the consumer. What you are suggesting is an economic concept, a concept that has been developed by economists known as tax shifting, right? That it may be possible in some scenarios for the entity that bears the statutory incidence of the tax to shift the economic burden of the tax to someone else. In the case of the general sales tax, we assume the consumer. You follow me? This is a concept known as tax shifting. If you have a situation where the entity that bears the statutory incidence of the tax is able, not necessarily by any deliberate action, in fact, it's really not, doesn't work that way most of the time, but somehow manages to shift the economic burden or the economic incidence of the tax to another entity, that's a phenomenon known as tax shifting. And there are lots and lots of taxes. Economists can pretty well establish that there are lots and lots of taxes where there's at least some degree of tax shifting. And the general sales tax is undoubtedly one of them. I think your intuition is probably right. For the most part, when you have a broad-based tax like a general sales tax, it is more likely that the economic burden of the tax is going to be shifted to consumers and away from retailers. Do you understand what I mean by a broad-based tax? A tax that is imposed on lots of different things. So, for example, the difference between the general sales tax, which, by the way, what's the state rate in Texas of the general sales tax? Per $1, what is it? Well, that is the combined state and local rate. in some places in Texas. The state sales tax rate is 6 1/4.
Oh, yeah, they added.
6 1/4. And some local governments have a local sales tax option. The maximum that it can be in Texas is 8 1/4. Okay? So if you're in Sugar Land, for example, and you go to the mall, nobody goes to the mall anymore, I know, but if you go to the mall and you buy some item at Macy's, does Macy's still exist over there anymore? You buy some item, you buy your sweater at Macy's, and you know they're going to impose 8 1/4% sales tax. Okay? So if you're, again, you know, your intuition is telling you that, well, Macy's isn't bearing the economic burden of that tax. I'm bearing the economic burden of that tax because they just added on to my bill. But again, it's not that simple. It's probably true with the general sales tax in most instances. But there are other kinds of sales taxes, selective sales taxes, or I like the term excise taxes, that it's not as clear. There are some items where you have retail sales, okay, and there's a special sales tax rate imposed upon them. That's called an excise tax. Gasoline, for example, okay? When you go pump a few gallons of gas in your car at the gas station, you're not paying 8 1/4 sales tax. You're paying a special excise tax, a special sales tax, a selective sales tax. I like the term excise tax, okay? And in Texas, it's about 38.4 cents per gallon. Not about, it's not about, it is 38.4 cents per gallon. So of that $2.30 or whatever it is of the price of gasoline right now, almost 40 cents of that is tax. 18 cents is, roughly 18 cents is a state excise tax, and the rest is a federal excise tax.
Texas has a relatively low excise tax for gas.
I'll show you some numbers here in just a second, but that's an interesting comment that you made. You said poor gas station owners, operators. You know, people who work in the convenience store industry, at least people who have some management or ownership stake or whatever, will tell you that they don't make any money on gasoline.
Exactly, that's what I'm thinking.
They don't, but they know that. They know they're not going to make money on gasoline. That they make their money by tempting you to come in and buy donuts,
Really?
or sodas, or
I mean,
hot
guys
dogs, or
stop
whatever.
somewhere, and usually for gas, so might as well sell you stuff.
So gas is not a lucrative business to have a gas station.
It is.
Well,
and-
not if all you're selling is gas. If
Okay.
all you're selling is gas, then the answer is it's probably not going to be lucrative. Here it is. Texas is 38.4 cents, and again, you can see 20 cents is state excise tax, and 18.4 is federal.
So,
Okay?
California's expensive, actually.
Yeah, you know what? I just have some general categories here. I could click on this, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to. We can find out the exact amount for California, but it's great. It's almost $0.50. That's why, you know, the price of gasoline in California is always going to be higher than it is in Texas,
I heard it
because
was-
their excise tax is much higher.
I heard it was over $5 recently for a gallon.
Yeah, I mean, that wouldn't surprise me. I mean, it does tend to be much higher in places like California. I recently was in Arizona over spring break, and the price of gasoline is much higher in Arizona than it is here. So Texas, it's pretty cheap. Okay? All right, so anyway, without digressing too much on the gasoline tax, I'm just using that as an example of a selective sales tax. And, you know, when it comes to the question of who pays a selective sales tax, I like to use excise taxes to illustrate this point, but it can apply in all kinds of different taxes, okay? We're gonna do a little economic analysis here, okay? So let me remind you of the questions that we're addressing here, okay? First of all, does it matter who the government imposes the tax? How many of you, just a quick show of hands, how many like graphical analysis? Oh, excellent. You've come on a good day, because we're going to do some graphical analysis. For those of you who don't think you like graphical analysis, well, you will after we're done.
So it's a trick question.
Okay, so look, I'm going to try to make this point here. In answer to the first question, does it matter who government imposes the tax on? Using an excise tax. And it can be a tax, you use your imagination on whatever good you want it to be. A bottle of water or whatever you want it to be, yes.
I saw someone that asked a question, actually, my economics professor, he said, does it make sense that LeBron James is paying the same price for his toothpaste as you, me? He asked that question, you know. about-
Well, your economics professor is just a nut.
But it's kind of true though, to think that, you know, these guys
Yeah, I
are
don't-
damn near billionaires, and they're spending the same amount of money for stuff that we buy too.
Actually,
Well, I tell you what, see, I often joke
But
with,
still,
I often joke with people who will listen to me that even more ridiculous than that is that they get free stuff because they're.
that is true.
I
That
do
is
know
true. They got a lot of
that,
free stuff.
I do know that works in the sports industry.
Anyway, look, let's focus on this issue here, okay? So I'm gonna try to answer this question for you. Does it matter? Think about a sales tax, okay? In a market for any good, again, whatever you want the good to be, cell phones or, let's suppose that the government imposes a special tax on that good, okay? Now, we're not gonna get in too much in the weeds here in terms of the economics, but I do wanna just remind you from your basic economics lessons that you've had, even if you only took economics in high school, that a market is an arrangement of voluntary exchange, okay, for some good or service. In other words, you have people who want to purchase and consume the good, and you have people who are willing to supply it to the market. So you have demanders and suppliers, okay? And the way that economists represent that market is generally with a two-dimensional graphical representation, where on the horizontal axis, you have the price of a good, and on, excuse me, I said horizontal, the vertical axis, you have the price of a good, and on the horizontal axis, you have the quantity, either the quantity demanded or the quantity supplied. And so we could start with either side of this market, either the demand side of the market or the supply side of the market first. I have it drawn up so that we do the demand side first, okay? So generally the way that economists will represent the demand for a good in a market is with a downward sloping curve to the right like this, okay? So that at high, relatively high, whoops, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Let's see here. Yeah, that's okay. Look, at relative, I just didn't draw it in. At relatively high, look, what's the price right here where I'm pointing the
Very
cursor?
low.
No, yeah, be exact. It's zero, right? The price right here is zero. So as you go up this vertical axis, the price is increasing, right?
Yeah.
Now, what is the quantity at this point right here?
Zero.
Okay, and as you go to the right along this horizontal axis, the quantity is increasing, right? Okay, so what this little graph suggests, that the part that we're seeing right now, is that at relatively high prices up here, let me get a pen here. That'll help. I'll highlight it. At relatively high prices up here, say in this range, the quantity demanded is going to be relatively low here,
Yeah.
right? And at relatively low prices down here, the quantity demanded is going to be higher here.
Because it's hard to-
Can you see that the quantity demanded here is, it's greater at Q prime than it is at Q,
Yeah.
okay? And that makes some intuitive sense, right? As the price of this bottle of water goes up, we expect in the market for fewer bottles of water to be
Let's
consumed,
buy it and then more-
right? Economists call that the law of demand. Okay, why the law of demand and not the hunch of demand or the, speculation of demand or what? Well, what do we mean by a scientific law? A scientific law is a theory that has been tested out so much over many repeated experiments, over many repeated trials, that and so much evidence has been found to support it that the scientific community just accepts it as a truism. It's just reality. Not only is it consistent with your intuition, but it's also a scientific law, the law of demand. Okay? Whoops, how do I get rid of these pointer options?
Erase all.
Yeah, recall.
Second.
Thank you. Okay. All right. So that's the demand side of the market. Now, they represent the supply side of the market typically with an upward sloping to the right curve like this. That suggests that at higher prices, as the price increases here, the quantity supplied to market increases. And that makes intuitive sense as well. After all, if you're in business supplying something to market and the price goes up, that sends you a signal because you're a profit maximizer, get more of these to market. Okay? So again, it's not just intuition, it's a scientific law. There's lots and lots of evidence, lots and lots of evidence to support that that's the behavior that suppliers engage in. Prices are signals. So an increase in price sends a signal to consumers to demand less. A decrease in price sends a signal to consumers to consume more, right? An increase in price sends a signal to suppliers to supply more to market. A decrease, less supply. When the price of oil tanks and bottoms out, what do they stop doing? They stop drilling, right? Now, where these two curves intersect, right here, can you see that that is the only point that satisfies the condition, the equilibrium condition that quantity supplied equals quantity demanded? This point right here, where these two curves intersect, is the only point at which this is true. Quantity supplied equals, if we need to put numbers on there to I'm just making up numbers. Maybe these are in the millions. Right? What's the quantity demanded here? It's 4. Right? What's the quantity supplied? It's 4. Right? Okay, so if we trace that point where these intersect at the equilibrium condition back over to the horizontal, or excuse me, to the vertical axis, that's where the market sets the price. The market sets the price. The government doesn't set the price. No individual supplier sets the price. No individual demander sets the price. You have lots of consumers and lots of suppliers competing in the market and no government intervention. This price is set on, it's a self-regulating thing. Okay? The equilibrium price is set at the point where quantity demand equals quantity supply. Yes?
But doesn't like artificial inflation and artificial restriction also happen?
Artificial what?
Well, you know, like when, let's say someone has a lot of supplies, they could sell it for cheaper, but they only ship out less, so they can sell it for a higher price.
Let me tell you all something about economics, okay? In the study of economics, okay? The models that economists develop are typically very simple models, and it's based on the idea that the real world is very, very complicated. Okay? But if you can't understand this very, very simple and highly stylized model, you have no chance of understanding what happens in the real world. So while there may be a temptation to say, yeah, but what if, and if you can do this, you know, if they do this, what if they do this? Let's hold off on those kinds of, you know, things until we have a good understanding of the basic, simple model. Because I'm going to complicate it a little bit here for you in a matter of moments. Okay? The main point that I'm trying to make for you right now is that in a capitalist economy, in an economy that assumes, or in a market that assumes perfect competition, when you take your microeconomics course, which is a sophomore level course, if you have that in your degree plan, it's a great course. Your professor is going to introduce you to different models of markets, perfect competition, monopoly market, oligopoly. There's several different, you know, types of markets. What we're assuming here is perfect competition, which is a very big assumption, and it oftentimes doesn't hold. That's why people always want to ask questions about, well, what if this, what if that? Because our intuition tells us, or our experience probably tells us that these conditions of perfect competition don't really hold all the time or even maybe usually hold in the real world. But as I said, you got to kind of understand the model first, okay? All right, so again, it's a self-regulating market, by which I mean that the price is just set at the point at which quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, okay? Now, put a couple of numbers up here just for illustration's sake. Let's say that we're talking about a quantity of 6 here and a price of 8. Okay, and again, if you want to think about that in the millions, then that's fine. Okay. All right. Now I've shaded this area here because what this area suggests, everything to the left of the intersection of these two curves, and above the equilibrium price, below the demand curve, represents what economists call consumer surplus. Okay? What is it? Why do consumers get into the market? Okay? Well, because they want to derive satisfaction from the goods that they consume. Okay? I buy this bottle of water, okay, and I take a drink, and I go, right? I'm deriving satisfaction from drinking this bottle of water. Now, as an individual consumer, I'm going to have what economists refer to as a reservation price, okay, which means,
I won't pay more than.
look, that's the most I'm going to pay for this thing. And, sometimes we delude ourselves and say our reservation price is $1.50. I would never pay more than $1.50 for a bottle of water. But you get to the vending machine and it's $1.75, and you go, well, I'm really thirsty. So you understand what I'm saying? Like, the reservation price is not what consumers say their reservation price is. It's the maximum that they're really willing to pay. But if my reservation price is actually $1.75 and I only have to pay $1.50 for this, I am literally, economists are going to try to convince us that I am literally 50 cents or 25 cents better off than when I started. If my reservation price is $1.75 and this cost, the purchase price is $1.75, then I'm really indifferent between having this bottle of water and not having it. Or I'm indifferent between having the bottle of water and having $1.75 in my pocket. Okay? But if it's only $1.50, you can bet I'm going to put that $1.50 in the machine and drink, and I'm going to take that extra right? That's the consumer surplus. Now, for all consumers, that's represented graphically as the difference between what they would have paid and what the equilibrium price is. And if we multiply that by the output in the market, then we can get an actual measure of the consumer surplus. Okay? This area down here, the difference between the equilibrium price and the seller's cost, the supply curve just represents the seller's cost. Okay? So the difference between what it costs the seller to bring a good to market and the equilibrium price is called what is it called? If I'm supplying these things to market and it costs me $1 to bring these to market and the equilibrium price is $1.50, the difference is my profit. Right? So the opposite side of the coin is, from consumer surplus, is seller's profit. Okay, now one of the reasons that many economists love markets is because, again, if certain conditions hold, people who enter into these markets are generally better off than before they entered into the market. Right? Both sellers and consumers, suppliers and demanders. Okay? Graphically, though, we can just represent that here. Okay? Now, let's suppose that, to get to the point at hand, remember the question that we're trying to address here is, does it matter if the government imposes a 50-cent tax per bottle, let's say? I don't remember what the amount was I used, but for now, let's just say 50 cents. I'll change it in a minute if I need to. Okay? 50 cents per bottle of these. Okay? And in the first scenario, the government's going to impose that on consumers. It's that scenario that I was joking about where I go into the convenience store and I pay the clerk for $1.50 for the bottle of water, and then before I can leave, the tax man pops up and says, "Oh, wait a minute, you got a matter of 50 cents tax on that," right? So that's the statutory incidence of the tax being imposed on the demander, not something that happens. As I can't think of very many examples where that actually happens. Okay, but again, just for sake of illustration. The way that economists are going to represent that is with a shift of the demand curve inward toward the origin here, okay? So that at all price points, that lowers demand. The difference here between these two is the amount of the tax, okay? So for example, well, in my example, I wasn't thinking of bottled water here, I was thinking of something else. Let's say that the excise tax is $3, okay? So we are going to initially say that this has several economic effects. The imposition of the tax has several economic effects. One thing that you can absolutely guarantee that the tax is going to do is it's going to lower output in the market. Okay? Taxes are inefficient. Didn't say they weren't necessary, just said that they're inefficient. Right? And so it's going to lower the output, okay, from QE here, the equilibrium output, to the equilibrium or to the output with the tax. Okay? But that new equilibrium creates two new price points. Okay? Let's say it reduces it from 6 to 4. Okay? But it creates two new price points. We now have the price that is realized by the consumer, and we have the price that is realized by the seller. Okay? Indicated as P subscript C and P subscript S, respectively. Price to the consumer, price to the seller or supplier. Okay? And notice the difference between these two is what?
$3.
The amount of the tax.
Yeah, the tax, yeah.
Okay? $3. Okay? So one of the things that this graph tells us is that whereas the statutory incidence of the tax may be imposed on the buyer, the consumer in this case, both the supply side of the market and the demand side of the market is going to suffer an economic burden. Is going to have an economic burden. Okay? And the way that we can illustrate that is by showing that, well, a couple of things here. I don't want to skip over too much. Okay, first of all, okay, here's an initial consideration for us. This is an easy calculation to do, given the numbers that I've provided here. What is the tax revenue to government? The tax revenue to government is simply an excise tax, like what we're describing, is the amount of the tax per unit times the number of units. Okay? So I'm telling you that the tax is $3, and we have 4 units that is the output in the market. So that's easy arithmetic. 4 times 3 is 12. Or if we're talking millions, 12 million. $12 million of tax revenue generated for government by imposing a $3 tax on these. Okay? Which seems like a pretty low tax for a cell phone. But you get the idea.
Well, now that you said
Okay?
that, the bigger things have bigger tax.
Yeah, but again, I'm not thinking of a perfect example here, but
No, you're fine.
okay? So now, look, there's some other things that we can sort of figure out here, okay? What portion of the economic burden of this tax is going to be borne by consumers and suppliers, respectively, okay? So remember I told you that the consumer surplus is everything above the equilibrium price and below the demand curve, all right? So, but now we have this new demand curve with the tax here, and so we're talking about the portion of the tax that's being borne by the consumer as the difference between the price realized by the consumer and the quantity. So it's just, the difference between $9.50 and $8 is $1.50 times the quantity of 4, which is $6 or $6 million. Okay? And what is the amount of the tax that's being borne, the economic burden of the tax that's being borne by the supplier? Well, again, it's the difference between $8 and $6.50, which is $1.50 times 4, which is $6. So in other words, what I'm telling you is the way that I've drawn this up here is that both the consumer and the sellers are being negatively impacted by this tax in about the same amount. Does everybody see that? I know this is a new kind of analysis for many of you, so don't be shy about asking questions. Okay? What we're identifying here first is, remember that the amount of the tax initially here we said was $3 times 4, which is $12 million. Right? Now we want to know how much of that $12 million is being borne by the consumer and how much is being borne by the supply side of the market. Okay? And the way that we do that is we just take the difference between the price realized by the consumer and the price, equilibrium price, which is $1.50, as I said. Same with the seller, it's $1.50 times 4. So they're both, of that $12 million, they're both getting about $6 million of the hit. Okay, now, what if, like the scenario about the taxman popping up from behind the counter, that's ridiculous, right? That doesn't happen in the real world. Let's say it's more like what we see in reality, where the statutory incidence of the tax is going to be imposed on the supply side of the market. So how do economists represent that? Well, they represent that with a shift of the supply curve inward toward the vertical axis like this. And again, the amount of the tax is $3, okay? And we get the two new price points, the price realized by the consumer and the price realized by the seller, okay, which is $3. The total of that is $3. And again, if we do the arithmetic, the tax revenue to government is still $12. $12 if government imposes it on the buyer, is $12 if government imposes it on the seller in this scenario. Okay? And how much of that is borne by the consumer? Oh, well, again, $6. And by the seller, oh, again, $6. So in answer to the question, I'm going to put them up here side by side so that you can see it more clearly. Here, the tax is imposed on the demand side of the market. Here, it's imposed on the supply side of the market. All we're asking here is about the question about the statutory incidence, right? Does it make any difference economically? Okay? The answer is no. It's exactly the same. Look at this. It doesn't matter. It's $12 to government here, $12 to government here, $6 borne by the consumers here and here, $6 borne economic cost borne by the sellers here and here. The answer to the question, economists tell us, there's every theoretical and empirical reason to say that it doesn't matter whether the government imposes the tax on demanders or suppliers. So what does matter? What does matter? What does make a difference in terms of whether consumers pay more, whether the tax burden is shifted to consumers, or whether it's shifted backward or something like that? Well, the answer is what economists call elasticities. Okay? So everybody understands the law of demand now. Law of demand generally means that as price goes up, consumers demand less, quantity demanded goes down, or as price goes down, consumers demand less. There are all kinds of elasticities that economists will introduce you to when you take your economics course. You'll deal with price elasticities of demand, price elasticities of supply, income elasticities. There's no shortage of elasticities. I'm, again, going to try to keep it as simple as possible and just talk about one type of elasticity, price elasticity of demand. Now that word elasticity, I started to say, and I backed off of it, so let me wind it back up again here. We know that the law of demand says that as price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. As price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. There's an inverse relationship. But the really important question that we often want to know is by how much. If price goes up by a little bit, how much does quantity demanded go down? By how much does it go down? Or if price goes down, by how much does quantity demanded go up? Okay? So if a good is relatively price inelastic, that suggests that over a large range of price changes here, you get very little change in quantity. In other words, in simple layman's terms, consumers aren't that sensitive to price changes. that they're going to keep on consuming in the amounts that they consume pretty much regardless of whether price goes up or down. It's inelastic.
I think it depends on whatever.
It depends on a lot of things, but right now, I just want to make sure everybody's clear on what we mean by the concept of inelastic. It just means that consumers are not very sensitive to price changes, regardless of what causes those price changes, including the matter of a tax. Okay? Can you think of a good where demand is likely to be price inelastic?
Gas?
Gasoline? Is that what you're talking about? Gasoline?
Well, I mean, everyone kind of needs it, so.
Yeah, I mean, no, I just want to make sure that's what you meant. I didn't know if you meant like, you know, like in helium and balloons or something, right? No, you mean like gasoline, right? I think, at least in the short run, it's very likely to be inelastic. In the long run, consumers can make changes like buying more fuel-efficient cars or, you know, different forms of transportation and so on. But certainly in the short run, it's inelastic. People still have to get to work. They still have to get to school, take their kids to daycare or whatever they have to do, and they're going to have to pump gas in their car. So I think you're probably right, at least in the short run, okay? One example that students often give, and I think they're absolutely right, is cigarettes, all right? The demand is likely to be relatively price inelastic for cigarettes. People who smoke cigarettes, probably because they're addicted, are going to keep smoking regardless of whether the price of cigarettes goes up or down. At least in the short run, until they can find some solution to quit smoking, right? So we may be able to think of other goods that are relatively inelastic, where the price is relatively inelastic, where demand is relatively price inelastic, okay? Now give me one where you think is price elastic. I'll give you one. Bottled water. The price of bottled water goes up to $5, you can bet people are going to stop buying so much bottled water.
Wine. We'll find other beverages.
Okay? If the price of bottled water goes down from let's say this is $2 in a convenience store, if it goes down to $1, people are going to buy more bottled water, right? It's probably pretty price elastic. Is that okay? So everybody clear on what we mean by price elastic versus price inelastic? We got one person answering for the entire group. Everybody else good? Okay. All right. So now we're going to imagine that the government imposes this tax on a good that is relatively price inelastic. Okay. And it's going to impose it on the demand side. Remember, it doesn't matter. We've already established it doesn't matter if it imposes it on the demand side or the supply side. So I just drew this up on the demand side. Okay. So now look, here's our original price and quantity. Okay. Where these two curves intersect. The government is going to impose this $3 tax on the demand side of the market, okay? And when it does, look what happens. Here we have our first economic effect, okay? Whereas in the first instance, we saw a reduction from 6 to 4. Now we have a reduction from 6 to only 5. See, consumers are not as sensitive to price changes. They're still going to keep on buying because it's inelastic, right? Okay. It creates these two new price points, okay? The price realized by the consumer here, the price realized by the seller down here or the suppliers down here. Notice the difference between these is still $3, okay? However, the portion paid by the way, what's the tax revenue to government? Somebody calculate that for us here. Who can do that? How much tax revenue is government going to get out of this? With this output and this tax. Excuse me, this output here.
That's 15.
Yeah, it's just 5 times 3.
The tax times
The tax times the output. Because it's, remember, we're talking about excise tax per unit. So that arithmetic is real easy. Okay? But now how much of that is borne by the consumers? Okay? Well, it's this portion here. Okay? 1050 minus 8 is 250 times the output, which is 5, 1250. Of the $15 or 15 million, consumers are bearing 12 and a half. The greater share of the economic burden of that tax. And suppliers much less, right? For suppliers, it's only 8 minus 750, which is 50 cents, times 5, which is 250. Who do you think shares the bigger burden of the excise tax on a pack of cigarettes? Consumers or tobacco companies? Or the whole supply chain, right? It seems like it's probably going to be consumers.
Yeah.
Okay? Again, maybe because of the addiction issue, but there's lots of evidence to suggest that consumers don't change their smoking behavior just because the government, raises the excise tax on cigarettes. By the way, there's a reason why in many states, for example, Texas would certainly be one, where historically state legislatures, when they have considered tax increases, generally consider things like cigarette taxes first. That's always the first option. Some people call them sin taxes.
Raise the cigarette.
No, look, I mean, some people call them sin taxes. There's this perception that there's an effort here to punish people for being immoral, but I'm going to suggest a different reason to you, right?
They know.
Why?
The government knows that they're not gonna change their.
It's going to produce a fairly stable source of revenue for government, right? Because consumers don't change their behavior. That's exactly right. If you ever hear a politician say that we're going to raise the cigarette tax because we want to encourage people to stop smoking, you should immediately call them out, okay? And say you are either a bold-faced liar or you are ignorant of basic economics.
It's not gonna stop them.
It's not going to stop people from smoking. Your intent is not to stop people from smoking. Your intent is to produce a stable source of revenue for government. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not suggesting to you that there's anything wrong with producing a stable source of revenue. I'm just saying that that's the more likely motivation for choosing cigarette taxes. And by the way, gasoline taxes, for example, at least in the short run, it produces a relatively stable revenue stream for government. Okay, but that point aside, does everybody see this point about which, in this instance, if it's relatively inelastic, the consumer is going to bear more of the economic burden? Now, what about the scenario where it's elastic? Elastic means that consumers are very sensitive, right? And so they do change their consumption significantly as a result of price increases or decreases, okay? So economists typically would draw that up this way, okay? So we have our original output here of 6 and our equilibrium price of 8, okay? And the government steps in and puts a $3 tax per unit on that, okay? Now look what happens to the output. Consumers are sensitive to price changes, including price changes that result from tax increases, right? So we would expect then that one economic effect of that would be to reduce the output by even more than what we've seen to this point. Not quite there yet, but you're right, okay? I just want to make sure everybody sees this point first, right? The inefficiency that you're going to get here, the loss of output that you're going to get is much greater when you have elastic demand. So here's our $3 tax, and you can see that the difference between $8.50 and 8 is 50 cents. That's the portion that is, well, there's the tax revenue to government. Shouldn't skip over that, right? Why doesn't government impose an excise tax on bottled water? What's the exact opposite explanation that I gave you about cigarettes? Why don't they put a $3 tax on this? Where's the tax revenue? Where are you getting?
It's not stable.
It's not going to produce any tax revenue for government, right? There's a very logical reason they don't put excise. You know, back in the 1980s, let me digress here for just a moment. Back in the 1980s, the authors of your textbook report this to you. I'll end on this point and we can finish this up next time. Back in the 1980s, Texas went through a very significant economic crisis. The price of oil per barrel of oil fell dramatically. I think it went from something like $28 per barrel to something like $8 per barrel in a very short period of time. And Texas in those days depended heavily on oil and gas severance taxes for state revenue. And that meant that the money in the state's treasury began to dry up very quickly. That there was no money being generated, no tax revenue being generated. And so the legislature was called by the governor into special session to deal with this emergency matter. And they started throwing out all these proposals for tax increases. And one of them that actually passed was an excise tax on newspapers. This was in the days when people still read newspapers. Okay? The Houston Chronicle, the Dallas Morning News, the Austin American Statesman. And I don't remember I have to be honest with you, I don't remember what the amount was. Let's just say it was 50 cents. Okay? By the way, who do you think fought the legislature bitterly on that? The publishers of the papers, right? Because they understood something about their circulation. They understood it was probably price elastic, right? And people weren't going to pay for whatever reason. If it's a tax increase or whatever, they're just not going to pay an additional 50 cents for a daily newspaper. And that's exactly what happened. Circulations went way down. They ultimately got it repealed. They got the legislature to repeal that. Okay? But there's a reason why government, legislative bodies, when they're identifying things to place taxes on, they predictably pick certain kinds of things and not other kinds of things. Newspapers aren't going to produce revenue. Tax on revenue is not going to produce the revenue. Okay? So anyway.
What about alcohol?
Alcohol is, in Texas and most other states, it's a special excise tax. And it is pretty stable. I think the revenue stream is pretty stable. So it's probably pretty inelastic.
Yeah, that's what I think too, is restaurants, bars, people.
Maybe not to the extent as tobacco, but it's still relatively inelastic. Yeah.
That's a little strange, the excise tax on alcohol expecting a stable income, yet I believe on certain times on Sundays, I think in the morning, you're actually not allowed to sell alcohol.
Yeah, there may be other, look, we're trying to explain everything away here in terms of the revenue stream for government, but sometimes even politicians will sacrifice revenue to satisfy other objectives. And in Texas, that has meant, we used to have something in Texas called blue laws. Now, those weren't unique to Texas. Most states in the country had these so-called blue laws, which meant up until fairly recently, maybe the early 1990s, they were still in place in Texas where, for example, you couldn't go to a mall on Sunday. Well, you could go to the mall, but none of the stores would be open because they were closed by the state blue laws. They had to be closed. Yes, I'm not making that up. Not that long ago, just a few short years before you were born, it was illegal for stores and malls and so on to operate on Sundays in Texas. Now, clearly had a detriment, or a negative effect on tax revenues to government, but they were doing it for some other reason. You can use your imagination as to why, but I suspect the reason that they repealed those blue laws was because of the tax revenue. Oh, wait a minute, we got to take advantage of the tax revenue that we get from those Sunday sales. Okay, we're out of time. We'll finish this up on Thursday.